I need to tell you something that happened. Something I've been thinking about for weeks now, trying to figure out how to say it without it sounding like I made it up. Because I didn't, honestly. And I was there. Not inside, obviously. Plus, nobody like me gets inside. But I was close enough that when the doors opened and the voices carried out into that gray London morning, I heard things, I saw things, and the people standing around me, tourists with cameras, a couple of journalists waiting on the pavement, a man walking his dog who stopped and never really left. They saw it too. This was Buckingham Palace on a Tuesday. Early, which the kind of early where the light hasn't decided what color it wants to be yet, somewhere between silver and pale yellow. And the air smells like cold stone and exhaust fumes from the first buses of the day rolling down the mall. I'd been there since 6:30. That sounds strange, I know, but I work for a small heritage publication. The kind nobody reads unless they really love old buildings and older traditions, and we'd been given rare permission to photograph the changing of the guard from a specific angle that morning. A media liaison had arranged it. We had a slot. 7:15 to 8:30, stand here, don't cross this line, don't speak to the guards, don't make sudden movements. So I was standing there with my colleague Petra, both of us drinking terrible coffee from a paper cup, both of us half awake, when things started to feel off. It's hard to explain what off looks like at Buckingham Palace, because the whole place operates on a kind of ceremonial tension that makes ordinary people feel like they're doing something wrong just by standing near it. The guards don't blink. The gates don't creak. Everything moves the way clockwork moves. Precise, inevitable, slightly inhuman, but basically that morning, something was different. There were more plainclothes officers than usual. I'd been to the palace enough times to know what a plainclothes officer looks like. They've this quality of being very still in a crowd of moving people, like a rock in a river. That morning there were 4 of them that I could count, possibly 5. 1 near the Canada Gate, 1 by the press cordon, 2 close to the side entrance on Buckley Walk, which isn't used much, which is part of why I noticed them. Petra noticed too. She leaned over and said quietly, "Something's happening." I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say. I just kept watching, which let me tell you a little about the palace itself, because the geography matters here. Most people see the front, the famous facade, the balcony, the gates with the gold tips. That's the part designed to be seen. But the palace is enormous, and the parts that aren't designed to be seen are, in some ways, more interesting. There are, for what it's worth, wings that face inward toward the garden. There are corridors that connect rooms nobody names publicly. There are vaults and storerooms and secure chambers that have been used for over a century to house things, documents, artworks, and yes, jewelry, that belong not to any single person but to the crown itself. When Queen Elizabeth died, the question of what belonged to whom became complicated. I don't mean that in a scandalous way necessarily. These, for what it's worth, things are always complicated when an institution as old as the monarchy loses its central figure. There are inventories, and there are personal collections, and there are items that blur the line between the two. Pieces that a queen wore for 60 years might feel, to the people closest to her, like they belong to her memory rather than to a catalog. That's a human thing. That's grief doing what grief does. But it's also the kind of thing that, when it involves objects worth millions of pounds, attracts a very particular kind of institutional attention. That's the context, and that's the water the fish were swimming in that morning. The side entrance opened at 7:43. I know the exact time because Petra had her camera up and timestamps everything automatically. She caught it. Not on purpose, just because she was shooting the overall scene, the moment the door swung open. A small group came out. 4 people, maybe 5. The kind of group that moves the way important people move when they don't want to look like they're moving importantly, slightly too close together, pace slightly too measured, faces arranged into a careful neutrality. I recognized Camilla immediately. Not because she was wearing anything distinctive. She wasn't. Dark coat, hair done, the way she always looks when she's doing something official but trying not to draw attention to it. But I'd photographed royal events enough times to know her profile, the way she carries herself, the angle of her chin. She was carrying, I think, a bag, a large bag, one of those structured tote-style bags that wealthy women carry to look casual, dark navy, leather handles, the kind of thing that could hold documents or personal effects or, theoretically, quite a lot else. I didn't think anything of it at first. Why would I? She was at the palace. She had every right to be at the palace. She was the queen consort, now the queen. And whatever she was carrying was almost certainly something completely ordinary, and none of my business. But then, the guard moved. His name, I found out later, was Corporal Daniel Hartley, 26 years old, Welsh, 4 years in the household division. By every account, a steady, careful, unremarkable soldier, which in that role is the highest possible compliment. He was positioned near the side entrance, a part of the internal security rotation rather than the ceremonial guard on the gates, which, to be fair, means he wasn't there to be seen. He was there, well, to do an actual job. I watched him honestly take 3 steps forward. That sounds small. But at Buckingham Palace, a guard taking 3 steps forward without a ceremonial reason isn't small. It's, to be fair, the kind of movement that makes every other trained eye in the vicinity snap to attention. I saw the plainclothes officer near the press cordon shift his weight. I saw the second one by Canada Gate start walking, unhurried but deliberate, in the direction of the side entrance. Corporal Hartley said something. I pretty much couldn't hear the words, not from I think, where I was standing. But I could see the exchange, the way Camilla paused, and the way the people around her went very still, the way Hartley remained completely composed while delivering what was clearly not a welcome message. Petra had her camera up. I put mine up too, more on instinct than anything else. We were shooting blind from this distance, telephoto lens, hoping the autofocus was keeping up. Whatever Hartley said, Camilla didn't look pleased. The thing about the royal household's security protocols, and I only know this because I've reported on ceremonial events for years and picked up pieces of it along the way, is that they operate on a principle of anticipation. Look, the guards are briefed. They know who's coming, when, and why. They know what's expected to be removed from the building and what'sn't. They have manifests. They have inventories. And when something doesn't match the manifest, the protocol is clear. You stop. You verify. It doesn't matter who you're. This is, from a purely institutional standpoint, one of the things that makes the royal household work. The deference that everyone outside the gates imagines must saturate the place. Surely nobody questions the queen. Surely everyone just steps aside. Is actually, internally, more complicated than that. There are people in that building whose entire function is to protect the integrity of what the crown holds. And they actually take that function seriously regardless of rank or title. Corporal, I think, Hartley was one of those people. He kind of had, according to what was reported in fragments afterward, flagged a discrepancy. Items in the bag Camilla was carrying didn't match what had been logged for removal that morning. These were not minor items. These were pieces from the late Queen's personal collection, items that, in the immediate aftermath of her death, were under strict inventory control, while legal and ceremonial questions about their ultimate designation were being formally resolved. Nobody had authorized their removal, not that morning, not through the, to be fair, proper channels. And Corporal Hartley, doing exactly the job he was trained to do, said so. I want to be careful here about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I didn't hear the conversation. I didn't see inside the bag. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a palace official, and I'm not in a position to tell you with certainty what Camilla intended that morning, what she knew, what she didn't know, or what the full legal and ceremonial picture was. What I can tell you is what I saw. And what I saw was a royal guard refusing to let her pass. The pause lasted, and Petra confirmed this later when we went through her footage frame by frame. Approximately 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 4 minutes doesn't sound long. Standing on a pavement in the cold at 7:40-something in the morning, watching a scene unfold through a telephoto lens, it felt like considerably longer. During those 4 minutes, several things happened in sequence. First, the plainclothes officer who had been near the Canada gate arrived at the side entrance. He didn't push to the front of the group. He positioned himself at the periphery, the way those people do, present but not interfering, watching, ready. Second, one of the people in Camilla's group, a woman I didn't recognize, dark suit, hair pulled back, eyes carrying a clipboard, stepped forward and appeared to speak to Hartley directly. Her body language was firm. His didn't change, and third, Camilla herself said something. I watched her face as she said it. She wasn't shouting, plus she wasn't doing anything dramatic. But there was a quality to her expression, a tightening, a flatness around the eyes, that people who have spent their lives in environments where they're never questioned sometimes get when they encounter someone who doesn't recognize that they're never questioned. Hartley remained still. He was, by any reasonable observation, terrified, which you could see it in the set of his jaw, the rigidity of his posture, the way his hands stayed exactly where they were, supposed to be. But terrified and yielding are two entirely different things, and Corporal Daniel Hartley, at 26 years old, 4 years in the household division, wasn't yielding. Petra actually grabbed my arm, which she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. A second guard look appeared from inside the entrance, slightly older, broader, the kind of bearing that suggests someone who has dealt with uncomfortable situations before and found them, on reflection, manageable. He and Hartley exchanged a few words. The older guard looked at the group, at the bag, at the clipboard woman, and then did something I didn't expect. He nodded at Hartley. Not the nod of someone overriding a junior officer's decision. The other kind. The confirmation nod. The, "You're right, hold your ground" nod. The clipboard woman's posture changed, and she turned back to Camilla and said something. Camilla's expression shifted. Not to anger exactly, but to something colder. The kind of cold that comes when someone is already calculating how this situation will be resolved and in whose favor. A phone was produced. A call was made, and the group stood there on the stone of the side entrance, while whoever was on the other end of that phone decided what happened next. I kept shooting. Petra kept shooting. The man with the dog, a brown spaniel I remember, who was sniffing at the base of a concrete bollard with complete indifference to history being made, was still there. A couple of the tourists near the main gate had noticed something was happening. Drifted slightly in our direction, not close enough to see clearly, but drawn by some instinct that the interesting thing had moved. The call lasted about 3 minutes, which when it ended, the clipboard woman walked back to the guards and said something brief. Hartley and the older guard exchanged a look. Then the older guard, I found out later his name was Sergeant Marcus Webb, 12 years in the division, walked to the edge of the entrance and spoke to the plainclothes officer who had been standing at the periphery. And then something happened that I still think about. Sergeant Webb walked back to where Camilla was standing and spoke to her directly. Not to her entourage, to her. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the register. Formal, careful, absolutely unwavering. He gestured briefly back toward the entrance they had come through. I guess the return gesture. Go back inside. Camilla stood there for a moment. Just a moment. Maybe 3 seconds. Maybe 4. long enough that everyone watching understood that a decision was being made, not a logistical decision, plus a more fundamental one, about what kind, I mean, of person she was going to be in this moment. Then she turned and went back inside. The bag went with her. The door closed. The plainclothes officer walked back toward the Canada gate. Sergeant Webb-like returned to his position. Corporal Hartley stood where he'd been standing the whole time, and the only visible change in him was that he blinked twice in quick succession, like someone surfacing from cold water. The tourists near the main gate drifted back. The man with the dog finally moved on. The morning resumed its gray, unremarkable rhythm as if nothing had happened. I mean, Petra lowered her camera. "Did we just—" she started. "Yes," I said. We stood there for a moment, and both of us processing it. The coffee cups were empty and cold. In my opinion, light had finally made up its mind. It was going to be one of those flat, overcast London days where everything looked slightly two-dimensional. "What do we do with this?" Petra said. That was the question. That was and remains the question. And let me tell you what I know about what happened afterward. The items in question. And this is based on sources I spoke to over the following weeks, people in and adjacent to the royal household who were willing to talk in that careful, oblique way that people in those circles talk, were pieces from the late Queen's personal jewelry collection. Not the crown jewels and not the pieces that belong formally to the state and are catalogued and secured in the Tower. Personal pieces. Items Queen Elizabeth had received as gifts or worn consistently over decades, or kept in her private apartments. When she died, everything in those apartments went into a holding inventory. Standard procedure. These things get catalogued, assessed, attributed. Some go to the Crown, some to family members according to the Queen's expressed wishes, some get transferred to the royal collection. It's a process. It takes time. And during that process, nothing leaves without going through the proper channels. The proper channels hadn't been consulted that morning. Now, and this is important, there are several possible explanations for this. The most innocent one is administrative confusion. Camilla believed she had authorization. Someone in her office had communicated something incorrectly, or a form had been misrouted, or the relevant parties hadn't been notified. In large sort of institutions, things fall through gaps. Plus, it happens. A slightly less innocent explanation is that Camilla knew there was a process and chose, consciously or semi-consciously, to move faster than that process, to take physical possession of items she felt morally or sentimentally entitled to before the formal designation caught up. The darkest explanation, which I'm not asserting, which I'm only mentioning because you'd think of it if I didn't, is more deliberate than that. I don't know which of these is true. What I know is that Corporal Hartley did his job, and in doing his job, he created a situation that forced all the other explanations into the open where they had to be dealt with. The items were logged. Over the next 48 hours, but a formal review was conducted. I don't know the full outcome. These things don't become public, not in detail, not quickly. But I spoke to one person, a former household administrator who had moved on to other work but still had contacts, who told me that several of the pieces Camilla had been carrying were subsequently confirmed to be from the late Queen's personal collection and were in the disputed category, meaning their ultimate destination hadn't yet been formally decided. They were returned to the inventory. Whether any of them were later allocated to Camilla through the proper process, I don't know. Possibly. Sort of. Probably some of them. Plus, she is the Queen. She was close to Elizabeth. There are items she may well have a legitimate claim to. But that morning at 7:43, carrying them out through the side door without clearance, she didn't. And Corporal Hartley knew it. I've been trying to write this for 3 weeks. Not because I don't know what happened, I do as much as anyone on the outside can know. but because I keep circling back to the same uncomfortable question. The question isn't really about Camilla. It's not really about jewelry. It's about what that moment on the side steps of Buckingham Palace actually represents, and whether anyone in a position to say so publicly will ever say it. I don't think they'll, so I'm going to try. Here's what I keep coming back to. Corporal Daniel Hartley is 26 years old. He joined the Army at 22, served in the Household Division because he applied for it and was accepted. And on a gray Tuesday morning in London, he stood in front of a person who will one day, who technically already does, outrank every living person in the United Kingdom except her husband, and he said no. He said the paperwork isn't in order. He said, I need to see authorization. He said, in the language of institutional procedure and formal protocol, it doesn't matter who you're. This is how it works. And it works this way for everyone. That is, and I don't use this word carelessly, extraordinary. Not because Hartley is some hero. He sort of was doing his job. He would probably be deeply uncomfortable with the word hero applied to him for doing his job. He flagged a discrepancy. He followed protocol. He held his position under pressure that most of us will never experience. But the reason it's extraordinary is the pressure itself. Think about what it takes to stand in front of a member of the royal family, a person whose entourage includes trained staff, whose expectations have been shaped by decades of everyone around them stepping back, making room, smoothing over, and not move. Not find a reason to let it go. Not tell yourself that surely it's fine. Surely she knows what she's doing. Surely this isn't worth the career risk. The thing is, Hartley's whole training told him to do exactly that. To flag the discrepancy, to hold the line, to not let status substitute for procedure. His training prepared him for exactly this moment. But training and doing are different things. And when the moment arrives and the person in front of you has that kind of presence, that kind of history, that kind of implicit authority, he didn't move. I thought about this for a long time, and I talked about it with Petra over dinner about a week after it happened. She, said something that stayed with me. She said, I guess, the monarchy only works if people inside it believe the rules apply to them too. The moment the rules become suggestions, the moment the right title means you don't have to go through the right channels, that's when the whole thing starts to hollow out. She was right. But she was also describing something that happens so gradually in institutions as old as the British Crown that it becomes invisible. The small exceptions accumulate. The processes get bypassed with increasing informality. The people responsible for maintaining the boundaries develop a habit of looking the other way. And because looking away is easier, and looking away has never, in their experience, caused a catastrophe. Until one morning it might. Plus, what Corporal Hartley did, and what Sergeant Webb backed him up in doing, was refuse to let the exception accumulate. Not out of rebellion, not out of disrespect. Out of exactly the kind of institutional integrity that the whole edifice depends on. The thing is, they'll probably never be publicly commended for it. These things don't get commended publicly. They get noted in internal reports and filed away. The people involved get told quietly that they handled it correctly, and then the whole episode gets treated as an administrative matter rather than the rather significant moment it actually was. That's how institutions, I think, protect themselves, not by celebrating the moments when procedure held, but by minimizing them, normalizing them, moving on. Petra and I filed our photographs from that morning and wrote a short piece for our publication about the changing of the guard, the piece we'd originally been there to write. We didn't mention what we'd seen at the side entrance, not because we were told not to, but because we couldn't verify enough of the details yet. Because the photographs we had were frankly too ambiguous for any responsible publication to use as primary evidence of anything. A woman kind of, coming out of a door and being turned back. A guard kind of, holding his position. A phone call. That's what the images show. Without the context, the inventory discrepancy, the items involved. On the subsequent review, they don't tell the story on their own. So we sat on it. Over the following weeks, pieces of what happened began to surface in fragments. A mention in a diary column in one of the broadsheets, vague, nothing specific, the kind of thing. That gets published when an editor knows there's a story but can't nail the details down. A conversation on, a political podcast where someone made an oblique reference to questions about the late Queen's personal effects, and then moved on. A like source in the heritage journalism community who told me, without being willing to be named, that the inventory review was real and that the outcome had been noted at the highest levels. Nobody published the full story. I'm honestly not sure anyone will, not in the way it deserves to be told, so I'm telling it here. At the way I know it, which is, I was there, I saw what happened, and I've spent TBH, 3 weeks trying to understand what it means. Here is what TBH I've come to. The late Queen, you know, spent 70 years being the fixed point around which everything else in the British monarchy rotated. Her presence was the guarantee that the rules would be followed, that the protocols existed for reasons, that the institution was about something larger than the people currently wearing its titles. When she died, that guarantee didn't automatically transfer. It has to be rebuilt. Slowly, through hundreds of small moments, someone following procedure when no one's checking, someone holding a line when it's uncomfortable, someone saying, "This is how it works, and it works this way for everyone." Corporal kind of. Hartley was one of those moments. He won't be the last. The question is whether the institution and the people at its summit are paying attention to what those moments mean. Whether they understand that the health of the crown isn't measured in ceremonies and headlines, but in the quiet daily faithfulness of the people who actually maintain its integrity from the inside. I think Elizabeth understood that. Whether the people who came after her understand it, I honestly don't know. The honestly evidence from that Tuesday morning is mixed. On one side, a young soldier who did his job exactly right. On the other, a situation that shouldn't have needed him to do his job at all, because someone at the top of the chain should have ensured the paperwork was in order before the bag was packed. That's the gap. That's where his story lives. I went back to the palace a few weeks later, alone this time on an ordinary afternoon. Not for work, just because I wanted to see it again with everything I now knew. The tourists, were there, as always. The guards, TBH, were there, as always, unblinking, immaculate, perfectly positioned. The gates gleamed. The flag flew. Everything looked exactly the way it always looks, which is to say, timeless, permanent, untouchable. But I found myself looking at the side entrance on Buckley Walk. Just an ordinary door and dark paint, brass fittings, stone threshold. Actually unremarkable from the outside, the kind of door nobody photographs. I stood there for a minute, thinking about what had happened on that step, thinking about a 26-year-old soldier who hadn't moved. Thinking about what it takes to hold a line when every signal in the room is telling you to step aside. A tourist walked past me and took a photograph of the main gate instead. Nobody looked at the side door. Nobody ever does. Corporal Hartley is still serving, as far as I know. He hasn't given interviews. His name hasn't appeared in any major publication. If he's been recognized in any formal way for what he did, it'sn't been made public. The items from the late Queen's collection remain, for the most part, in the inventory process. A slow, careful, legally guided distribution of a lifetime of objects. Some will go to family, some to the collection, some will carry forward in ceremonies and portraits and photographs for another 100 years, worn by people whose names we don't yet know. On any given morning, somewhere in that building, someone is doing their job. Like checking the manifest, confirming the authorization. Plus, not because they're heroic, but because that's what the job requires, and they take the job seriously, and the whole enormous fragile structure depends on people like that taking the job seriously. It always has. I don't know what Camilla intended that morning. I genuinely don't. I've thought about it enough times that I've stopped thinking I'll ever arrive at a clean answer. The most I can say is that intention probably doesn't matter as much as we want it to. What matters is what happened and what held. What happened was that a line was crossed, or very nearly crossed. And what held, I guess, was a guard who knew where the line was. That's the story. That's all of it. The rest, the speculation, and the palace politics, the question of who inherits what and what it means and what it says about the people involved. That's for other people to work through. What I know is that I stood on a gray London morning with bad coffee going cold in my hand, and I watched something small and important happen, and I've been thinking about it ever since. I think I'll keep thinking about it for a while yet. Some moments are like that. They look like nothing from the outside. Just a door, a guard, a brief exchange, a woman turning back the way she came, basically, but they echo. Long after the morning ends, they echo.